Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about one of the most common questions I get, which is how I deal with the stereo image, in particular, the width of the stereo image in mastering, whether something sounds narrow and mono or whether it sounds wide and spacious. And it also has an effect on the kind of the 3D depth of the image, how much feeling of space there is, how far sounds can be set back in the stereo image field. And obviously what you can do in mastering is limited to a fairly heavy degree. It's the kind of thing you really need to get right in the mixing. It's all to do with where the sounds are panned, whether you're using delays or reverbs, or whether you've got natural room ambience on the sounds. But you can have an influence on it in mastering. And also, to a certain extent, you can measure it, which I think it's one of the challenges is getting your monitoring system to the point where you can hear stereo imaging really accurately. And I mean, this is my home mastering studio. When I first set it up, I'm using high quality hi-fi speakers, nothing super expensive. And when I first set it up, I was actually concerned that I was hearing some really strange things going on in the stereo images of some recordings. And I was worried that actually that was a problem with my monitoring setup. Maybe things were bouncing off the walls and cancelling out, and I was hearing reflections, or the shape of the room was a problem. Something in here was a problem. And I discovered a really cool tool which enabled me to reassure myself that actually what I was hearing was super accurate. I'm really surprised at how accurate the monitoring is in here, in particular, to do with stereo image and the image field. And I thought I would share that with you. So I'm going to start by just playing you an example of something that has something interesting going on with the stereo image, in particular with the phase of one of the instruments. This is a song called Along the River by Freaks of Funk. And this is a rough mix by Segador from Skonrock Studio. And he posted this on the Facebook page of my home mastering masterclass course. Lots of the members there post things to get feedback from other members, and occasionally I chip in as well. And I picked up on it and thought it was a really interesting example. I was looking for something to use in a video like this. So let me just play you a section. So I think question one is whether you can hear anything unusual or interesting about that. I'm going to say this is not an extreme thing. This is just something that I noticed and I thought made an interesting example. So I'll tell you that what I'm hearing is something slightly strange about the guitar. I'll play it to you again. And while I do, keep an eye on the correlator. So watch what's happening when the bass is playing, and then watch what happens when the guitar comes in. And listen to see if you can hear what effect that has. So you can probably see that the correlator is almost at +1 while the bass is playing. And then when the guitar comes in, especially as it gets into the sustain of the note, the correlation value drifts down towards 0. And I'm actually going to pull up the NewGen visualizer plugin, which has quite a nice correlator built into it. I'm using correlator to start with. It's a nice simple tool. There's one in Voxengo Span. There are a bunch of correlator plugins that you'll be able to get hold of for almost no money if they're not included in your DAW already. And then I'm going to show you some extra features that Visualizer has, which are more unusual and which I really like. So watch for the correlator down the bottom here. One of the really nice things about the NewGen is it has a history function. So I'm just going to enable that because it will enable you to see a trace of the correlation as the song is playing. If I just take it back to the beginning, you can see the difference there. So let's talk about what correlation is first. The correlation is just a number. The software, or you used to be able to get hardware needle correlators, compares the left and right channels of a stereo mix. And if both of them are identical, which means you've got a mono signal that's panned hard center in the middle of the image, the correlation value will be +1. Whereas if one of those channels was inverted in polarity, sometimes called phase inverted, which can be achieved using this button on a mixing desk, the correlation would be -1. And that would actually sound pretty odd. Let me give you a demonstration of that. So I'll just start this playing. And then I'm going to mono the signal using the TT meter. And you can see that whereas before the correlation was almost 1, but there was some stereo kind of information left in the signal from the drums, now it's really +1 only. But if I then flip the polarity, the phase of one of the channels, you can see the correlation flips to -1. And if you listen, that sounds very different and actually a bit odd. So those are the extreme correlation values. And if I just disable the mono button there again and play you some more, I think maybe now hopefully you'll be able to hear how within this stereo rough mix, most of the elements are mono, but the guitar has a much wider stereo image and the correlation is getting down to around about 0. And that's the kind of value you might see for something with a very wide stereo image, say a symphony orchestra with a huge spread, or a choir, or maybe a natural acoustic ambient soundscape. Most rock and pop music sounds better with a correlation of around about 1/2. You can go a little bit less, you can go a little bit more. You probably don't want a correlation of 1 because that means your signal is pure mono. And just as a rule of thumb, if you want to try using a correlator yourself, I recommend that your mixes and your masters stay between 0 and 1. They should never go negative. And when things start to go below about 1/2, maybe you've got too much stereo information in the signal. I mean, I don't know where this interesting correlation for this mix came from. It could have been to do with the mic placement. Maybe they had 2 mics on the guitar cab and there were different distances between the mics, which can have caused phase issues. Maybe this is some processing that the band have applied after the effect to try and get some kind of stereo guitar effect. Maybe one of the channels is delayed. It can also happen if you use too much in the way of chorus, or, I mean, sometimes people actually flip the polarity of one channel of an instrument to try and get a stereo width effect. And that's a hint that I've heard sometimes online. I seriously don't recommend you do that, because if I temporarily move the TT meter later in the processing chain here, so that we have one phase inverted down here, then listen to what happens when I hit the mono button. The bass has disappeared completely. So that's why I recommend you don't have a correlation, certainly not of -1. You should never polarity invert one channel of a stereo instrument, because it literally turns the waveform upside down. So when those waveforms are combined, when you mono them, they cancel out completely. And in this case, the bass and the snare just disappear. One of the things I listen out for as a mastering engineer, I mean, if you have things that are very out of phase, they can still cancel out, which means that people will hear a very different mix in mono than you intended when you were mixing in stereo. And the correlator is a great way to warn yourself about that issue if maybe your monitoring environment isn't picking up on these problems. I mean, to me, sitting here, it's as clear as day. And if you're listening on headphones, you'll probably find it's very obvious to you as well. But I have been asked to go out and help people with setting up and mixing in their own studios where I've heard issues like this are not nearly as obvious. And it could be something just as simple as the listening position not being quite central between the speakers. Phase issues become less noticeable then. And don't get me wrong, if you want to use these kind of effects creatively in your mixing, be my guest. But I think it's important to understand what you're doing, understand the effects of what you're doing going into it. Because the last thing, I mean, you know, I've heard where one channel has been polarity inverted, and the majority of the piano sound disappears when you listen to it in mono. And if it's an important melodic or rhythmic element to the mix, that's a big issue. You need to know about that. So let's put the polarity of this mix back where it was. Now I'm going to show you a really cool feature of the NewGen visualizer, which is much less common. And this is actually a feature that I requested NewGen to add to the visualizer when they sent me the beta version of version 1. So it's really cool that it's in there. Because as I say, correlators are pretty much everywhere, and you can already see that they're a really valuable tool. The correlator instantly gives you a flag that maybe there's something you need to be listening to more carefully, because it wasn't in that zone of +1/2 to +1 that I recommend. At least not when the guitar is playing. Now I'm going to switch on that extra feature in the visualizer. This is a correlator which is frequency dependent. So what we have here is low frequencies at the bottom, high frequencies at the top. And just for example, we can see that most of the bass information in this signal has a correlation of +1 because it's to do with the bass guitar. And most of the high frequency information in the signal has correlation that is much closer to +1, is much more mono than it is stereo, because we're probably picking up there that the snare and the sound of the overheads and the drums, there's some little subtle reverb things happening. Maybe that's what this big spike here is. Overall, that makes sense. But what this frequency dependent correlator is telling us is that there is a lot of out of phase information in the low mids, in that kind of 300 to 1K region. And that is exactly what I heard when I put this song on in my home mastering studio. And that was what I was concerned about in the early days of having set this room up, that maybe there was some kind of problem with my monitoring, because a surprising number of mixes and masters that I listened to suddenly jumped out at me as having these kind of issues. Not necessarily the whole signal being out of phase or with a correlation of -1, but with certain parts of the frequency range having lots of out of phase content. And that was the thing that, I wouldn't say alarmed me, but kind of worried me a little bit when I first listened in this room. And that's the kind of thing that I was really relieved when I plugged in the frequency dependent correlator from the visualizer to see those aspects actually were part of the mix. They were a genuine aspect of whatever had been done creatively when the song was recorded or mixed, not a problem with my monitoring. And the reason I'm telling you about it is that if you have a monitoring situation where you're less sensitive to these kind of issues, maybe the phase issues with this mix didn't jump out at you when you first listened to the song, having just a simple correlator, or even better, something like this in the NewGen visualizer, is going to be a real benefit to you, because it kind of gives you an instant check of where there might be something you need to listen more carefully to. So now the question is, what do you do about correlation issues or phase issues, polarity issues, when you find them in a mix or a master? One possibility is nothing. In this case, if we listen to this mix when it's monoed, I think we're going to hear the character of the mix change, but I don't think it's going to be disastrous. Let's just try that. So maybe we lost a little bit of body and warmth in the guitar tone there when we hit the mono button, but it wasn't a problem. We could still hear it clearly within the mix. Another option that you have is actually to narrow the image slightly. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. If I fire up the Melder Production stereo processor tool, the first thing I want to do is switch it to a phase linear crossover, because it's a multiband tool, and if we don't do that, it can introduce its own set of phase changes into the mix. You're unlikely to hear a problem with them, but I prefer to be safe. You will get more latency if you do that, though. And this is a pretty complicated looking beast, but you can see there's a simple control here called widening, and currently it's set to 0%. We can use that to affect the stereo image of the mix. So let me show you that. Incidentally, if you look at the stereoscope here, you can also see evidence of a very wide element of the mix. If I hit the mono button, okay, that's in the signal chain before, so I'll switch on the one in the visualizer. There, you can see that vertical line is what mono looks like. And actually, if I temporarily phase invert the signal, a horizontal line like that on a phase scope is evidence of something that is in complete antiphase, which, as we've said, is a problem. A less extreme example is to just narrow the width. So to do that, I'm going to drag the width slider here on the M stereo processor. That's about 50%. You can probably hear, and you can certainly see, that that has reduced the stereo width of the mix. If I bypass that, switch it back on. If I drag that down to 0, there you go, that's mono. So we can go anywhere between mono, the original width, and we can even make things wider. That's like boosting the side content in the mix. Even more stereo information. That's something else that sometimes it can be nice to do. Increasing the stereo width can add a feeling of depth. It can bring out the reverb. It can add space to the sound. You need to be very careful though, because if you go too far with these kind of widening effects, and actually even if you do that in the mix, you can get this kind of strange inside out quality to the mix. There are some people who actually feel slightly sick if you play them a completely out of phase signal. So these are potential creative tools for you in mixing and I guess in mastering, but I would be cautious. The final option you've got with the Melder stereo processor, which is quite nice, is to selectively change the frequency content of a particular frequency in the mix. So we identified earlier on that the out of phase content in this case is probably in between 200 and 1 kilohertz. So if I set the mid band there, let's just, the low mid band, let's just solo that and take a listen. Now we can narrow just that frequency range. You can probably hear and see. Let's just take that back a bit. If I bypass it, we can see the out of phase content again and hear it. So in that case, we were narrowing only the range between 200 hertz and 1 kilohertz in this mix, which might be a nice option in some cases, because obviously you could keep all of that width that was there in the drum sound and everything else, and only affect a particular portion of the mix. However, that's still going to introduce cancellation effects like it did when we used the simple stereo width tool, the broadband stereo width tool. So it will still change the guitar tone in comparison to what it was in the mix. So I guess that brings me to the main conclusion. 90% of the time, if I come across something like this, when I'm given something to master, I will refer back to the client and I'll say, did you realize the piano has got a lot of out of phase content, or maybe the backing vocals, or, you know, maybe the drum overheads. Drum overheads is a classic thing, because this can happen if you just have an XLR cable where two of the wires are flipped. Just a soldering error. That can cause one channel to be reversed in polarity and cause these kind of issues without anybody realizing. So I like to have a conversation with the client and see what they want to do about it, in preference to fixing it in the mastering, because the mastering will always be a compromise in this sense. However, with a case like this, where it's kind of borderline, where, even something extreme like hitting the mono button, it introduces a bit of a timbral change to the guitar, but it doesn't really change the overall balance of the mix. Either way, you've spotted the fault, even if it doesn't leap out at you from your monitoring, and you've got a discussion with the client, or you've got more information about the music if it's your mix. That's my goal here. So that's pretty much it. I think I'll just quickly show you some of the other features that the visualizer has, because it's a really nice set of tools for analyzing your audio. You've got the phase scope, which I already showed you, but you've also got this display here, which is showing me a frequency dependent left-right balance indicator. So you can see in this low mid area here, there is a bias towards the right hand side, which reflects the fact that the guitar is panned mostly to the right. The bass seems to be coming out ever so slightly to the left of the mix there when it's playing in those low frequency regions. So this is actually my default display for using the visualizer, because I mainly use it as a tool for analyzing what's going on in the stereo mix. If I'm hearing something that sounds interesting to me when I'm listening to the song, this is my first port of call for trying to figure out what's going on. And it also has a nice set of meters. The whole thing is very configurable, so I can choose to have those meters displayed vertically instead of horizontally. It has a frequency analyzer, similar to the one I already have in Wavelab. It has a really nice spectrogram display. And again, it's very configurable. So I have the correlator displaying frequency ranges in sixths of an octave, but I can choose to have the spectrogram display in much finer detail. Let me just show you that. So if you don't already have some kind of suite of analyzer tools, I really recommend the new gen visualizer. It's definitely something you might want to look into. And in particular, the correlation by frequency display and the correlator with a history trace as well. So I've covered quite a lot in this video. Just to recap, you should definitely find yourself a correlator, just a simple +1, -1 correlator, and start using it to get more feedback on your mixes. The correlator gives you a simple but surprisingly powerful idea of how wide your stereo mix is, and it can alert you to possible problems if there's too much antiphase content in your mix. If you're seeing it frequently dip below 0, there could well be a problem. If you're listening to the mix and thinking, well, not everything sounds really wide, maybe it's a particular aspect of the mix, and that's where a frequency-dependent correlator like the one in the visualizer might be useful. You can correct for the overall correlation of a mix, the overall balance between mono center information and side stereo information using a stereo processor, a simple stereo processor. There are some pretty fancy plugins out there, and I tend not to use those. My personal feeling is in mastering, if something needs something more advanced than a simple stereo width control, maybe it's a case then for going back in the mix. Sometimes, as you saw in the video, you might want to go in with a multiband processor and just manipulate certain areas of the mix. But with all of this stuff, you always need to be aware of the compromises that are involved and make sure you decide what's best for the music, not just a quick fix to make the numbers look right. But it's amazing how effective just a gentle kind of 10 or 20% increase in the stereo width can sometimes be for adding a little bit of extra space and life to a mix. You know, when you boost up that stereo width, you bring out some of the reverb, you take away some of the emphasis from the mono center of the image, you bring up some of the space and the depth and the 3D aspect in the mix. But you have to be careful, because if you go too far, it can sound like it's inside out or just overhyped. As always with mastering, balance is the key. You're looking to make your music sound the best that it can be in terms of EQ, in terms of level, in terms of dynamics, and in terms of stereo width. So there you go. I hope you found that useful or interesting. There's a ton more videos about mastering, recording, mixing on my website, productionadvice.co.uk. Check it out if you would like. Subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get future updates. My name is Ian Shepherd. Thanks for listening.